in the harsh wilderness of 1880s Arizona territory, where mercy was rarer than water and compassion could cost a man his life. One unexpected act of kindness would echo through 15 years of silence before returning as thunder across the desert. This is not a tale of romance or simple heroism, but a story of how a single moment of humanity between two strangers from warring worlds would reshape the destiny of an entire region. When cowboy Jake Morrison found a dying Apache woman abandoned by her own people, left to perish under the scorching sun, he had no idea that saving her life would plant the seeds of the most unlikely alliance the American frontier had ever witnessed. What began as one man's refusal to let another human being die alone would transform into a legend that would be whispered around campfires for generations. But this story truly begins not with the rescue, but with the return. 15 years later, when the thunder of horses' hooves announced that someone from Jake's past had come back to settle an old debt. Only this time, she didn't come alone. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Morrison's weathered face as he guided his horse through the rocky terrain of the Sonoran Desert. It was July 1884, and the heat was the kind that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, tracking a small herd of cattle that had wandered off from his ranch during a thunderstorm. The Circle M Ranch wasn't much to look at, but it was his life's work, and every head of cattle mattered when you were trying to make an honest living on the frontier. Jake was a man of 32 years, tall and lean from hard work and harder times. His hands were calloused from rope and leather, his skin bronzed from countless days under the desert sun. He had come to Arizona territory 5 years earlier from Texas, carrying nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a determination to build something lasting in this unforgiving land. The Apache Wars were still fresh in everyone's memory, and most folks thought he was crazy for trying to ranch so far from any settlement. But Jake had always been stubborn, and he believed that if a man worked hard enough and treated the land with respect, he could make a life anywhere. As his horse picked its way carefully through a narrow canyon, Jake noticed something that made him pull up short. There, half hidden behind a cluster of prickly pear cactus, was what looked like a bundle of cloth. But as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he realized with a start that it wasn't cloth at all. It was a person. Jake dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the still form. It was a woman, an Apache woman, lying motionless on her side. Her dark hair was matted with dust and dried blood, and her clothes, traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, were torn and stained. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, with high cheekbones and skin that would have been beautiful if not for the obvious signs of suffering etched across her features. For a moment, Jake hesitated. Relations between the white settlers and the Apache had been tense for decades. The recent capture of Geronimo had brought an uneasy peace to the region, but there were still raids, still violence on both sides. Finding an Apache woman alone in the desert could mean any number of things, most of them dangerous for a lone cowboy. But as Jake knelt beside the woman, his natural compassion overrode his caution. She was barely breathing, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Whoever she was, whatever had brought her to this place, she was dying. And Jake Morrison had never been the kind of man who could walk away from someone in need, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances that had brought them together. He gently turned the woman onto her back, checking for signs of injury. There was a deep gash on her forehead that had bled considerably, and her left arm appeared to be broken. But more concerning was her obvious state of dehydration and starvation. She looked like she had been in the desert for days without food or water. Jake quickly retrieved his canteen from his saddle and carefully dribbled a small amount of water onto the woman's lips. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering, but didn't wake. He tried again, this time managing to get a few drops in her mouth. She swallowed reflexively, which was a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting to survive. The nearest settlement was Tucson, more than 40 miles away through dangerous territory. Jake's ranch was closer, maybe 25 miles to the north, but that was still a long journey for someone in the woman's condition. He had to make a decision quickly. The desert sun was climbing higher, and every minute out here was reducing her chances of survival. Jake had built his ranch house with thick adobe walls and a deep well, knowing that water was the most precious commodity in the desert. If he could get the woman there, he might be able to save her life. But transporting an unconscious, injured person across 25 miles of rough terrain would be a challenge. He would have to improvise. Using his rope and some blankets from his pack, Jake fashioned a crude travois, a makeshift stretcher that could be dragged behind his horse. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could do under the circumstances. Very carefully, he lifted the unconscious woman and placed her on the travois, securing her with rope to prevent her from falling off during the journey. The trip back to the ranch was the longest of Jake's life. He had to stop frequently to check on his passenger and to give his horse rest. The woman remained unconscious for most of the journey, occasionally stirring and mumbling words in Apache that Jake couldn't understand. He found himself talking to her as they traveled, partly to keep himself alert and partly in the hope that the sound of a human voice might somehow reach her and give her a reason to keep fighting. "Don't you give up on me now," he would say, adjusting the blankets to keep the sun off her face. "We're going to get you fixed up, and then you can decide what you want to do from there. But first, we got to get you some water and some food and maybe clean up that cut on your head." As the hours passed, Jake began to wonder about the woman's story. What had brought her to that remote canyon? Had she been fleeing from something or someone? The Apache didn't usually travel alone through the desert, especially not women. There had to be a reason she had been abandoned or separated from her people. The sun was beginning to set when Jake finally saw the familiar outline of his ranch buildings in the distance. The main house was a low, sprawling structure built of adobe bricks, with a red tile roof and deep porches that provided shade during the hottest part of the day. There was a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings, all surrounded by a split-rail fence. It wasn't much compared to some of the big spreads back in Texas, but Jake was proud of what he had built with his own two hands. He guided his horse and the travois straight to the main house, where he carefully lifted the unconscious woman and carried her inside. The interior of the house was cool and dark, with thick walls that kept out the desert heat. Jake had built it with comfort in mind, knowing that the harsh environment outside made it essential to have a refuge where a person could rest and recover. He placed the woman on his own bed, the only comfortable place in the house for someone who was badly injured. Then, he set about the task of trying to save her life. First, he cleaned the wound on her forehead with water and whiskey, the only antiseptic he had available. The gash was deep, but not life-threatening if he could prevent infection. He bandaged it carefully with strips of clean cloth torn from one of his shirts. Next, he examined her broken arm. It was a clean break, which meant it would heal properly if set correctly. Jake had some experience with injuries. Living alone on a ranch meant that you learned to be your own doctor, but he had never treated anything quite this serious. He did his best to set the bone and fashion a splint using pieces of wood and more cloth strips. Throughout the night, Jake sat beside the bed, giving the woman small sips of water whenever she seemed conscious enough to swallow. He also managed to get some thin soup into her, made from beef broth and what vegetables he had on hand. Slowly, gradually, she began to show signs of improvement. Her breathing became more regular, and her color began to return. It was near dawn when the woman finally opened her eyes fully for the first time. Jake was dozing in a chair beside the bed, exhausted from the long day and night of caring for her. When he heard her stir, he immediately came alert, leaning forward to look into her dark eyes. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the white cowboy and the Apache woman, each trying to understand the situation they found themselves in. Jake could see intelligence in her eyes and wariness, but also a kind of quiet strength that told him this was someone who had survived more than her share of hardship. "Easy now," Jake said softly, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "You're safe. You're at my ranch, about 25 miles north of where I found you. You were hurt pretty bad, but I think you're going to be all right." The woman didn't respond verbally, but Jake could see her taking in her surroundings, assessing the situation. Her eyes moved from his face to the room around them, noting the simple furniture, the clean bandages on her arm and head, the glass of water on the bedside table. He could almost see her mind working, trying to understand why this white man had helped her instead of leaving her to die, or worse. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I've got some soup on the stove, and there's fresh water from the well. You need to get your strength back." The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her throat was probably still too damaged from dehydration to speak properly. Jake helped her sit up slowly and gave her small sips of water until she was able to swallow more easily. Then he brought her a bowl of the warm soup and watched as she ate slowly, carefully, like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. As the morning wore on, Jake began to see more signs of the woman's recovery. She was able to sit up on her own, though her broken arm was still causing her pain. She seemed alert and aware of her surroundings, and Jake caught her studying him with those intelligent dark eyes whenever she thought he wasn't looking. It was around midday when she finally spoke, her voice hoarse but clear. "Why?" she asked in accented but understandable English. "Why help me?" Jake had been expecting this question, but he still wasn't sure how to answer it. How do you explain to someone that you helped them simply because it was the right thing to do? How do you bridge the gap between two peoples who had been at war for generations? "Because you needed help," Jake said simply. "And because I couldn't live with myself if I just left you there to die. Doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. A person in need is a person in need." The woman studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she nodded slightly, though Jake could see that his answer had raised as many questions as it had answered. "I'm called Ayana," she said quietly. "It means eternal blossom in my language. I was traveling with a small group when we were attacked by soldiers 3 days ago. The others were killed or captured. I escaped but was wounded and became lost in the desert." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized how close Ayana had come to death. If he had been even a few hours later in finding her, she would have died alone in that canyon. The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said. "This is my ranch, the Circle M. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to get your strength back. When you're ready, I'll help you get wherever you need to go." Ayana's eyes widened slightly at his offer. "You would do this? Even knowing what I am? What you are as a person who is hurt and needed help?" Jake replied firmly. "Nothing else matters to me." For the first time since he had found her, Ayana smiled, just a small upturn of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. Jake realized that she was not just pretty, but genuinely beautiful, with a quiet dignity that even her current circumstances couldn't diminish. "You are not like other white men I have known," Ayana said softly. "Maybe that's because I don't see you as different from me," Jake replied. "We're both just people trying to make our way in a hard world. Sometimes it means we need to help each other, regardless of what we look like or where we come from." As the days passed, Jake found himself drawn to Ayana in ways he hadn't expected. She was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged as she regained her strength. She had been educated at a mission school as a child, which explained her excellent English, but she had returned to live with her people when she came of age. She spoke of her Apache heritage with pride, but also with the sadness of someone who had seen too much death and destruction. Ayana, for her part, seemed genuinely surprised by Jake's kindness and respect. She had grown up hearing stories of white men who killed Apache women and children without mercy, who saw her people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. Jake was clearly different. He treated her as an equal, asked for her opinions, and showed genuine interest in learning about her culture and her life. Jake's daily routine continued much as it had before, though now he had Ayana to consider. He tended to his cattle, repaired fences, and worked on various projects around the ranch. But he also made time to sit with Ayana in the evenings, sharing meals and conversation as her strength gradually returned. He learned about Apache customs and traditions, about their connection to the land and their complex social structures. In return, he told her about his own life. Growing up on a small farm in East Texas, losing his parents to fever when he was barely 18, and his decision to come west to build something of his own. They were both alone in the world, Jake realized. He had no family left, no close ties to any community. Ayana's group had been wiped out, and she spoke with resignation about the likelihood that most of her people were either dead, imprisoned, or scattered to the winds. In a strange way, they had found in each other the one thing that both had been missing: genuine human connection with someone who understood what it meant to be alone. By the end of 2 weeks, Ayana's physical injuries had largely healed. Her arm was still weak, but functional, and the cut on her forehead had closed cleanly, leaving only a small scar. She was able to move around the ranch freely, and Jake noticed that she had begun helping with small tasks: cooking, mending, organizing supplies. It was as if she was trying to repay his kindness in the only way she could. But Jake could also see that she was beginning to feel restless. She would stand on the porch in the evenings, looking out at the desert with a longing expression that told him she was thinking about her future. He knew that eventually she would want to leave, to try to find what remained of her people or to make a new life somewhere else. The thought of her leaving filled him with a sadness that surprised him with its intensity. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple, Ayana finally brought up the subject that had been hovering between them. "I must leave soon," she said quietly. "I have stayed too long already. It is not safe for you to have me here. If soldiers come, or if other white men find out that you are harboring an Apache, there will be trouble." Jake had been expecting this conversation, but it still hit him like a physical blow. "Where will you go?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "There are rumors of Apache groups hiding in the mountains of Mexico," Ayana replied. "Perhaps I can find my way there, find people who will accept me. Or perhaps I will simply travel until I find a place where I can live in peace." "You could stay here," Jake said suddenly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I mean, if you wanted to. This is a big territory, and there aren't many people around. You could have a life here, a safe place." Ayana turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. "And what would people say about the white cowboy who lives with an Apache woman? What would happen when others found out?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her words. She was right, of course. The social conventions of the time would make such an arrangement scandalous at best, dangerous at worst. But looking at her now, seeing the intelligence and strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning, Jake found that he didn't care what other people might think. "Let them say what they want," he said finally. "This is my land, my home. I get to decide who's welcome here. And you're welcome here, Ayana, for as long as you want to stay." Ayana's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Jake realized that his offer had touched something deep within her. "You would risk your reputation, your safety, for someone like me?" "For someone exactly like you," Jake corrected gently. "You're not just someone to me anymore, Ayana. You're important. More important than what a bunch of strangers might think." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging heavy between them. Finally, Ayana reached out and took Jake's hand in hers, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since that first day when she had been too weak to protest. "I will stay," she said softly, "for a while longer. But you must understand, this cannot last forever. Eventually, the world outside will intrude, and when it does, I will not let you suffer because of me." Jake squeezed her hand gently, grateful for whatever time they would have together. "We'll deal with whatever comes when it comes. For now, let's just focus on building something good here, something worth protecting." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake and Ayana continued to sit together on the porch, both of them knowing that they had crossed some invisible line that evening. Whatever happened next, their lives were now intertwined in ways that neither had expected when Jake first found her dying in the desert. They had found in each other not just companionship, but a kind of hope that had been missing from both their lives. The months that followed Ayana's decision to stay at the Circle M Ranch were unlike anything either she or Jake had ever experienced. What had begun as a simple act of mercy had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful, a partnership that defied every social convention of their time while creating something entirely new and unexpected. As autumn arrived in the Arizona territory, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rains that turned the desert briefly green, Ayana settled into life at the ranch with a natural ease that surprised both of them. She had an intuitive understanding of the land that complemented Jake's practical ranching knowledge perfectly. While he understood cattle and horses, business and building, she knew the desert itself, where to find water during drought, which plants could provide medicine or food, how to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes days in advance. Their partnership began with small things. Ayana showed Jake how certain desert plants could provide supplemental feed for his cattle during the harsh winter months, potentially saving him hundreds of dollars in purchased hay. She taught him to identify the signs of approaching sandstorms hours before they arrived, giving them time to secure livestock and equipment. In return, Jake shared his knowledge of animal husbandry, business management, and the practical skills of running a successful ranch operation. But it quickly became clear that Ayana brought more than just desert wisdom to the Circle M. She had a brilliant mind for organization and planning that Jake had never possessed. Within weeks of taking an active role in ranch operations, she had reorganized their storage systems, developed more efficient rotations for their small herd, and created detailed records of everything from weather patterns to cattle behavior that would prove invaluable for future planning. "You're wasting too much time riding the same areas every day," Ayanna pointed out one morning as they planned the day's work over breakfast. "The cattle have established patterns. If we watch them for a week and map where they go, we can check them more efficiently and spend the extra time on other projects." Jake had to admit she was right. He had been following the same routines he had learned in Texas, without considering how the different environment and smaller herd size of Arizona might require different approaches. "You think we could cut the daily riding time in half?" "At least half," Ayanna confirmed, spreading out the rough map she had been drawing of their property. "And I think we could improve their grazing rotation too. There are areas you're not using that have better grass and water access." Over the following weeks, they implemented Ayanna's suggestions and found that she had been conservative in her estimates. They were able to reduce their daily riding time by more than half, while actually improving their monitoring of the herd. The extra time allowed Jake to work on repairs and improvements to the ranch buildings that he had been putting off for months. As winter settled over the desert, bringing cold nights and the occasional snow to the higher elevations, Jake and Ayanna developed a comfortable domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural. They shared cooking duties, with Ayanna introducing Jake to Apache recipes that made use of desert plants, and Jake teaching her some of the hearty frontier dishes his mother had made back in Texas. Their meals became times for planning, discussion, and an increasingly easy companionship that neither had expected. In the evenings, they would often sit by the fire, reading from Jake's small collection of books or simply talking about their plans for the ranch. Jake had never been much of a reader, but Ayanna was hungry for books after years of having limited access to them. He found himself making the long trip to Tucson more frequently, partly to sell cattle and purchase supplies, but increasingly to visit the small lending library and bring back new books for her. "I had forgotten how much I missed this," Ayanna said one evening, looking up from a book of poetry Jake had brought her. "When I was at the mission school, I thought books were the most wonderful things in the world. I dreamed of having a library of my own someday." "What stopped you?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about this aspect of her past that she rarely discussed. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "My people needed me more than I needed books. There was so much violence, so much death. It seemed selfish to think about poetry and stories when children were starving and families were being torn apart." Jake understood. He had given up his own dreams of maybe studying law or medicine when his parents died and left him with nothing but debt and the need to survive. Sometimes life demanded that you set aside what you wanted for yourself in favor of what needed to be done. "Maybe it's not too late for either of us to have some of the things we dreamed about," Jake suggested gently. "Maybe that's what we're building here. A place where we can have both the practical things we need and some of the things we want." As the months passed, their partnership deepened beyond the practical aspects of ranch management. They began planning long-term improvements and expansions that would require both of their skills and knowledge. Ayanna suggested they could raise horses as well as cattle, using her knowledge of Apache horse breeding techniques and Jake's understanding of the market for good riding stock. Jake proposed building additional water storage systems and expanding their cultivated areas to reduce their dependence on purchase supplies. But their plans went beyond simple business considerations. They talked about making the ranch a place where people of different backgrounds could work and live together peacefully. It was a radical idea for the 1880s, when racial tensions were high and integration was viewed with suspicion by most white settlers. But their own partnership was proof that such cooperation could work, and they began to dream of creating something larger. "We could hire some of the displaced Apache men who were struggling to find work," Ayanna suggested during one of their evening planning sessions. "Many of them are excellent with horses and understand this land better than any white cowboy. And there are white men too who are decent people but can't find steady work. If we could bring them together here, show them they can work as equals." "It would be dangerous," Jake pointed out, though his tone suggested he was intrigued by the idea rather than dismissive. "There's still a lot of hatred on both sides. It might not work." "It works for us," Ayanna replied simply. "And we were supposed to be enemies too." As winter gave way to spring, Jake and Ayanna began implementing some of their plans. They built a new barn and expanded their corral system to accommodate horses. They dug an additional well and created a more sophisticated irrigation system for their garden areas. Most importantly, they hired their first employee, a young Apache man named Itsachu, whose name meant eagle, who had been struggling to find work after his release from a reservation. Itsachu was initially suspicious of working for a white rancher, and even more confused by Ayana's presence and apparent authority at the ranch. But within days, it became clear that this was unlike any other arrangement he had encountered. Jake and Ayana treated him as an equal partner in the work, listened to his suggestions, and paid him wages that were fair by any standard. More importantly, they seemed genuinely interested in learning from his expertise with horses and his knowledge of the local terrain. "This is not what I expected," Itsachu confided to Ayana and Apache during his first week at the ranch. "The white man treats us as people, not as servants or enemies. That is because he sees people, not colors or tribes," Ayana replied in the same language. "It is rare, but it is possible. Perhaps we can help others learn to see the same way." The addition of Itsachu to their small community marked the beginning of a transformation that went far beyond the practical benefits of extra help with the work. His presence proved that their vision of cooperation between different peoples could work in practice, not just in theory. Word began to spread throughout the territory about the unusual ranch where Apache and white workers labored side by side, where different cultures were respected and valued equally. Not all of the attention was positive. Jake began hearing rumors and complaints from other ranchers about his Apache sympathies and his dangerous ideas about racial equality. Some suggested that he was being manipulated or deceived by Ayana, that no good could come from trusting Indians. Others whispered that the relationship between Jake and Ayana was improper and immoral, though none dared to say such things directly to his face. The criticism bothered Jake less than he had expected it would. He had always been somewhat of an outsider anyway, having come to Arizona with little money and few connections. His success with the ranch had been built on hard work and careful planning, not on social acceptance or political connections. If some people didn't like his choice of employees or associates, that was their problem, not his. Ayana, however, was more concerned about the potential consequences of the growing criticism. She knew better than Jake how quickly whispered complaints could turn into organized opposition, how easily fear and prejudice could be whipped into violence. She had seen it happen before, had lived through the consequences of white fear and Apache resistance. "They will not let this continue indefinitely," she warned Jake during a conversation about their plans to hire additional workers. "There are men who see what we are doing here as a threat to their way of life, to their belief that whites and Indians can never live in peace. They will try to stop us. Let them try." Jake replied with more confidence than he felt. "We're not doing anything illegal. We're just running a ranch and treating people fairly. If that's threatening to some folks, then maybe they need to examine their own consciences." But privately, Jake was beginning to understand the weight of what they had undertaken. They weren't just running a business or building a home. They were challenging fundamental assumptions about race, culture, and the possibility of peace between peoples who had been enemies for generations. It was exciting and meaningful work, but it was also dangerous in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. As spring turned to summer, the Circle M ranch continued to grow and prosper. Their cattle herd had expanded, and their first horses were gaining a reputation for quality and reliability. They had hired 2 additional workers, a young white man named Tommy Rodriguez, who had been blacklisted from other ranches for his Mexican heritage, and an older Apache woman named Nailnish, who proved invaluable in managing their expanded agricultural operations. The diversity of their small community created challenges as well as benefits. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and occasional personality conflicts required constant attention and mediation. Jake found himself learning basic Apache phrases while Ayana worked to improve the English skills of their Apache employees. They instituted regular community meetings where everyone could air grievances and discuss problems openly, regardless of their background or position. "We are learning to be a family," Ayana observed one evening as they watched their diverse group of employees sharing a meal and stories around the fire. "Not a family of blood, but a family of choice. It is something new, something that has never existed before in this place." Jake nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction as he watched Apache teaching Tommy how to work with horses, while Nailnish shared recipes with their cook, an older white man named Charlie who had joined them after being laid off from a mine. It's not perfect, he admitted. There are still problems, still tension sometimes. But it's working better than I ever thought it would. The question is whether the outside world will allow it to continue working, Ayanna said quietly. I hear things when I go to town for supplies. People are talking about us, about what we represent. Some see us as an example of what could be possible. Others see us as a dangerous experiment that needs to be stopped. Their success had indeed attracted attention from beyond their immediate neighbors. Newspaper reporters had begun visiting the ranch, writing articles about their unusual community and their innovative approach to racial cooperation. Some of the coverage was positive, praising their vision and their practical achievements. Other articles were harshly critical, warning that such mixing of races would lead to social chaos and moral degradation. The attention brought both opportunities and dangers. Progressive leaders from back east began reaching out to them, asking if they would speak about their experiences or serve as an example for other integration efforts. Government officials inquired about their methods and their success rates with Apache workers. But the publicity also attracted the attention of groups that were violently opposed to any form of racial integration or cooperation. One afternoon in late summer, Jake returned from a trip to Tucson with disturbing news. There's talk of organized opposition, he told Ayanna and their core group of employees during an emergency meeting. Someone's been spreading stories about us harboring dangerous Indians, about us being a threat to white settlers in the region. There's even talk of a petition to have our ranch investigated by territorial authorities. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Jake's words. They all knew that official investigations could easily be used to justify seizure of property, deportation of Apache workers, or worse. The legal protections for Indians in Arizona Territory were minimal, and the rights of white men who associated with Indians were often viewed with suspicion as well. What do you think we should do? Itsachu asked, his English still heavily accented, but much improved over the months he had been with them. We keep doing what we're doing, Jake replied firmly. We run our ranch, we treat people fairly, and we don't let fear change who we are or what we believe in. But we also need to be prepared for trouble. We need to have plans in place in case someone tries to force us to change. Ayanna had been quiet during the discussion, but now she spoke up with a tone of calm determination that everyone recognized. There is something you all should know, she said. Something about my past that might be important now. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes before continuing. I was not just any Apache woman when Jake found me in the desert. My father was Cuchillo Negro, Black Knife, who was one of the war leaders in our resistance against the white soldiers. My brother is Tsaichli, who some of you may know as the warrior who has never been captured, who still leads a group of free Apache in the mountains of Mexico. The room erupted in surprised murmurs as everyone absorbed this revelation. Ayanna had never spoken of her family background before, presenting herself simply as a survivor of a massacre who had been separated from her people. The discovery that she was the daughter and sister of famous Apache war leaders changed everything about how their enemies might view the ranch and its inhabitants. Why didn't you tell us this before? Jake asked, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. Because I hoped it would not matter, Ayanna replied honestly. Because I wanted to build something new here, something not connected to the wars and the violence of the past. But if our enemies are going to use our success against us, then perhaps my connections to the old ways might be useful in defending what we have built. Jake felt a chill of premonition as he realized what Ayanna might be suggesting. If they were facing organized opposition from white settlers and territorial authorities, her family connections could indeed be valuable, but they could also escalate the conflict far beyond anything he had imagined when he first decided to help a dying woman in the desert. What exactly are you thinking? He asked carefully. Ayanna's smile was small, but determined. I'm thinking that if people want to treat this as a war, then perhaps they should remember that some of us know how to fight wars very well. And perhaps they should consider whether they really want to discover what happens when the daughter of Black Knife decides that her new family needs protecting. As summer faded toward autumn, the tensions around the Circle M ranch continued to build. Jake and Ayanna knew that they were approaching a crisis point where their vision of peaceful cooperation would either be allowed to flourish or would be violently destroyed by those who could not accept the possibility of change. But They also knew that they had built something worth fighting for, something that represented hope for a different kind of future in the American West. The choice of how to defend that future would soon be taken out of their hands, as events beyond their control began to move toward a confrontation that would test everything they had built together. The quiet months of building their unlikely community were coming to an end, and the time for harder choices was fast approaching. The autumn of 1885 brought more than just cooler weather to the Arizona Territory. It brought the kind of tension that made men check their weapons before leaving the house, and made women scan the horizon with worried eyes. Jake Morrison felt it in the changed attitudes of the few neighbors he encountered during his trips to town, in the suspicious glances from shopkeepers who had previously been friendly, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The Circle M Ranch had become something far more significant than Jake had ever intended when he first helped a dying Apache woman. What had started as a simple act of compassion had evolved into a symbol, either of hope for racial cooperation or of dangerous defiance of established social order, depending on one's perspective. Unfortunately for Jake and his small community, the second interpretation seemed to be gaining ground among the territory's white population. The immediate catalyst for the escalating tensions came in early September when a group of Apache raiders attacked a small settlement about 60 miles south of the Circle M. The raid resulted in the deaths of 3 white settlers and the theft of several horses and cattle. It was the kind of incident that had been occurring sporadically throughout the territory for decades, but this particular raid took on special significance because of rumors that began circulating almost immediately. Someone, no one could say exactly who, started spreading the story that the raiders had been seen watering their horses at a stream that ran through Circle M property. From that thin thread of circumstantial evidence, a much larger narrative was woven. That Jake Morrison's ranch was serving as a way station for hostile Apache raiders, that his Apache employees were providing information about white settlements to their relatives still on the warpath, and that the entire operation was an elaborate front for ongoing Apache resistance. None of it was true, of course. Jake's Apache employees were as horrified by the raid as anyone else, knowing that such violence would inevitably lead to retaliation against all Apache people, regardless of their actual involvement. But truth seemed less important than the opportunity to justify action against a ranch that had become an uncomfortable challenge to established racial hierarchies. They don't care whether we're actually helping raiders, Ayanna explained to Jake during one of their evening discussions about the deteriorating situation. They care that we exist at all, that we prove their assumptions about Indians are wrong. It's easier to destroy us than to admit they might need to change their thinking. The first concrete threat came in the form of a visit from a territorial deputy named Samuel Briggs, a thin, nervous man with pale eyes and a perpetual expression of disapproval. He arrived at the ranch on a gray afternoon in late September, accompanied by 2 other men who wore no badges but carried themselves with the aggressive posture of hired gunmen. "Morrison," Deputy Briggs said without preamble, not bothering to dismount from his horse, "I'm here on official business. There have been complaints about your operation here, serious complaints about harboring hostile Indians and interfering with territorial security." Jake stood on his front porch, very aware of Ayanna beside him, and his employees gathered behind them. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he had hoped to have more time to prepare for it. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Deputy?" "I'm not accusing you of anything yet," Briggs replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm conducting an investigation into reports that Apache raiders have been using your property as a staging area for attacks on white settlements. I'm also investigating reports that you've been employing Indians without proper authorization and that you've been allowing them to carry weapons in violation of territorial law." Both accusations were serious, and both were at least partially fabricated. The territorial laws regarding Apache employment were vague and rarely enforced, and Jake's employees carried weapons only for protection against wild animals and for their work with livestock. But Jake knew that in the current atmosphere, legal technicalities mattered less than political pressure. "You're welcome to investigate all you want," Jake said calmly, though his hand rested casually near the pistol on his hip. "We've got nothing to hide here. We run cattle and horses, we treat our employees fairly, and we mind our own business. If that's a crime, then maybe there's something wrong with the law." Deputy Briggs's eyes narrowed at what he clearly interpreted as defiance. Minding your own business would mean hiring white cowboys like every other rancher in the territory. It would mean understanding that there are natural boundaries between the races that shouldn't be crossed. What you're doing here isn't natural, Morrison, and it's not safe. Safe for who? Ayanna asked quietly, stepping forward. Jake noticed that the two hired gunmen tensed slightly at her movement, their hands shifting closer to their weapons. Safe for decent white folks who are trying to build civilized communities in this territory, Briggs answered, his distaste for having to speak to an Indian woman evident in his voice. Safe for people who understand that Indians and whites mixing like this always leads to trouble. The only trouble I see is the trouble you brought with you, Jake replied evenly. Now, unless you've got specific charges to file or specific evidence to present, I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business and move along. We've got work to do. For a moment, Jake thought Deputy Briggs might escalate the confrontation immediately. The man's face flushed red with anger, and his companions looked like they were waiting for an excuse to draw their guns. But, after a tense pause, Briggs seemed to decide that discretion was the better part of valor, at least for the moment. "This isn't over, Morrison," he said finally. "You can't hide behind that badge of yours forever. There are a lot of good people in this territory who are getting mighty tired of your Indian-loving ways. Sooner or later, they're going to do something about it." After the deputy and his men rode away, Jake called a meeting of all his employees to discuss the situation honestly. They gathered in the main room of the ranch house that evening, the diverse group that still amazed Jake, sometimes with its very existence. Itsachu and Nailnish represented the Apache perspective, while Tommy Rodriguez and Charlie Hawkins spoke for the white and Mexican workers. Ayanna, as always, served as a bridge between all the different viewpoints and experiences. "We all knew this day would come," Jake began, looking around at the faces of people who had become his chosen family. "The question now is what we do about it. I won't lie to you. This could get dangerous. There are people out there who would be happy to see this place burn to the ground and all of us scattered to the winds. Or worse," Itsachu added grimly. Everyone knew that Apache men caught in situations like this often simply disappeared, their bodies never found. "So what are our options?" Tommy asked. He was barely 20 years old, but the discrimination he had faced for his mixed heritage had given him a maturity beyond his years. Jake had been thinking about this question for weeks, ever since the rumors had started spreading. "We could try to lay low and wait for this to blow over. We can make changes to our operation that might satisfy the critics. Maybe let some of the Apache employees go, be more careful about how we present ourselves publicly. Or we can stand our ground and prepare to defend what we've built here. What do you recommend?" Nailnish asked. She was a woman of few words, but her opinions carried weight with everyone in the group. "I recommend we think very carefully about what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're willing to fight for," Jake replied honestly, "because I don't think laying low is going to work anymore. We've become too visible, too successful, too much of a symbol of something different. They're not going to leave us alone just because we try to be less noticeable." Ayanna had been quiet during the discussion, but now she spoke with the calm authority that everyone had learned to respect. "There is another option," she said. "One that Jake does not know about, but one that might change the balance of power here completely." All eyes turned to her as she continued. "I've been in contact with my brother, Saishli. He knows about this place, about what we have built here, and he is interested." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of her words. Saishli was a legendary figure among the Apache, one of the few war leaders who had never been captured or forced onto a reservation. His small band of followers had been conducting a guerrilla campaign against white settlements and military installations for years, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the desert mountains. The idea that he might be willing to involve himself in the defense of the Circle M Ranch was both thrilling and terrifying. "What kind of interest?" Jake asked carefully. "He sees what we have accomplished here as proof that his people and yours can live together without one dominating the other," Ayanna explained. "But he also sees it as something precious that must be protected from those who would destroy it. He has offered to help us defend this place if the situation becomes impossible." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what she was suggesting. "Ayanna, if your brother and his warriors get involved in this, it won't be a local dispute anymore. It'll be seen as an Apache uprising, maybe the beginning of another war. The military will get involved, and people will die. People may die anyway. Ayana replied quietly. At least this way, they would die for something meaningful. Over the following days, Jake struggled with the most difficult decision of his life. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a catalyst for conflict. All he had wanted was to build a successful ranch and live peacefully with people he cared about. But the world seemed determined to force him to choose between compromise and confrontation, between abandoning his principles and risking everything he had worked to create. The decision was taken out of his hands on a cold morning in early October when a group of about 20 armed men rode on his Circle M property without warning or invitation. They were led by a wealthy rancher named Harrison Caldwell, a man who owned one of the largest spreads in the territory and who had been vocal in his criticism of Jake's dangerous experiment with racial integration. Caldwell was a big man with gray hair and cold blue eyes who carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth and intimidation. Behind him rode an assortment of cowboys, drifters, and hired guns, all armed and clearly prepared for violence. This was not a social call or an official investigation. It was a show of force designed to intimidate and, if necessary, to destroy. "Morrison," Caldwell called out as his riders spread out in a semicircle facing the ranch house. "You and your Indian friends come out where we can see you. It's time we had to talk about the future of this territory." Jake emerged from the house with Ayana beside him, his hand resting on his pistol. His employees had scattered to defensive positions around the buildings, following a plan they had developed weeks earlier. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the ranch layout. "This is private property, Caldwell," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You and your men are trespassing. I suggest you state your business and move along before someone gets hurt." Caldwell's laugh was harsh and contemptuous. "Getting hurt is exactly what we're here to talk about, Morrison. You see, decent folks in this territory have had enough of your Indian-loving ways. We've had enough of watching you thumb your nose at the natural order of things. And we've especially had enough of you providing aid and comfort to savage raiders who kill innocent white families." "That's a lie, and you know it," Jake replied angrily. "We've never helped raiders, and we've never done anything but run an honest ranch and treat people fairly. Treating Indians like they're equal to white men isn't fair. It's an abomination," Caldwell shot back. "And harboring the daughter of Black Knife when every decent person knows her family has white blood on their hands. That's not just wrong, it's treason against your own race." Jake felt Ayana tense beside him, but he kept his eyes locked on Caldwell. "What exactly do you want?" "We want you to close this place down," Caldwell said bluntly. "Fire all your Indian employees, send that Apache woman back where she came from, and get yourself a normal crew of white cowboys. Do that, and maybe you can stay in this territory. Refuse, and we'll shut you down ourselves." "And if I refuse?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we'll burn this place to the ground and scatter your ashes across the desert," Caldwell replied with obvious satisfaction. "And we'll make sure that every other would-be Indian lover in the territory understands what happens to traitors to their own kind." Jake felt the familiar calm that always came over him in moments of extreme danger. He had faced down rustlers, hostile Apache raiders, and dangerous animals during his years on the frontier, but this was different. This was a direct challenge to everything he believed in, everything he had worked to build. There could be no compromise, no backing down. "Then, I guess we understand each other," Jake said quietly. "Now get off my land." For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation might explode into violence immediately. Hands moved toward guns on both sides, and Jake could sense his employees tensing for action. But then Caldwell held up a hand, signaling his men to wait. "You've got 24 hours to think it over, Morrison," he said. 24 hours to come to your senses and do the right thing. After that, we're coming back, and we won't be in a talking mood." As Caldwell and his riders departed, Jake knew that the quiet phase of their struggle was over. The confrontation everyone had feared was now inevitable, and the choices they made in the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of the Circle M Ranch, but possibly the future of racial relations in the entire territory. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last night of peace, Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told Ayana to send word to her brother that they would accept his offer of help. The war they had tried so hard to avoid was coming whether they wanted it or not, and they would face it with all the allies they could gather. As Ayanna dispatched a coded message through the network of Apache contacts she had maintained throughout her time at the ranch, Jake wondered if he had just saved his community or doomed it. But as he looked around at the faces of the people who had become his chosen family, he knew that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of cost. The storm that had been gathering for months was about to break, and when it was over, either their vision of peaceful cooperation would survive, or everything they had built would be reduced to ashes on the desert wind. There would be no middle ground, no compromise that could satisfy both sides. The time for half measures and careful diplomacy had passed, replaced by the stark clarity of an approaching battle that would test everything they believed about justice, loyalty, and the possibility of change in an unforgiving world. The 24 hours that Harrison Caldwell had given Jake Morrison to come to his senses passed like a fever dream, filled with frantic preparations and the growing certainty that their peaceful world was about to be shattered forever. Jake had faced danger before during his years on the frontier, but never had he felt the weight of so many lives depending on his decisions. Never had he been forced to choose between principles and survival with such stark clarity. As dawn broke on what everyone at the Circle M Ranch knew would be a day of reckoning, Jake stood on his front porch and surveyed the defensive preparations his small community had made throughout the night. It was a pitiful sight compared to what they would likely face. A handful of buildings scattered across several acres, defended by 6 adults with varying degrees of combat experience against what would probably be 20 or more well-armed and determined attackers. Itsachu and Tommy had spent the night creating firing positions behind hay bales and overturned wagons, while Charlie and Nailnish had prepared supplies and ammunition for what might be a prolonged siege. Ayanna had coordinated everything with her usual calm efficiency, but Jake could see the strain in her eyes as she contemplated the possibility that her decision to stay at the ranch might cost the lives of everyone she had come to care about. "Any word from your brother?" Jake asked as Ayanna joined him on the porch, carrying 2 cups of what might be their last peaceful cup of coffee together. "He received the message," she replied quietly. "But whether he can reach us in time." She shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both hope and resignation. Jake understood. Even if Tsai Shili and his warriors were willing to help defend the ranch, they were probably at least a day's hard riding away in their mountain strongholds. The timing would have to be perfect for them to arrive before Caldwell's attack was either successful or decisively repelled. "Do you regret staying?" Jake asked, voicing the question that had been haunting him throughout the night. "If you had left when you first talked about it, you wouldn't be in this danger now." Ayanna looked out at the desert, her dark eyes reflecting the red and gold of the sunrise. "If I had left, I would have died slowly in the wilderness, either from starvation or from the emptiness of having no purpose, no people to care about. Here, if I die, it will be for something meaningful, surrounded by people who have become my family. That is not a choice I regret." By mid-morning, lookouts posted on the ranch house roof spotted the dust cloud that announced Caldwell's approaching force. As the armed riders drew closer, it became clear that the rancher had not been bluffing about his intentions. He had assembled what amounted to a small army, at least 30 men, all heavily armed and clearly prepared for a serious fight. But there was something else approaching from the south that gave Jake a glimmer of hope. Another dust cloud, smaller, but moving faster, suggested that riders were approaching from that direction as well. Whether they were additional enemies or potential allies remained to be seen, but any change in the tactical situation might work in favor of the smaller defending force. "They're stopping," Tommy called down from his lookout post. "Looks like they're forming up about 400 yards out, just outside rifle range." Jake could see Caldwell's strategy. The rancher was smart enough to know that a frontal assault against prepared positions would be costly even against a small defending force. He was probably hoping that a show of overwhelming force would convince the defenders to surrender without a fight, or that a brief siege would starve them out without the need for an expensive battle. What Caldwell couldn't know was that the defenders had no intention of surrendering, and that help might be on the way. All Jake had to do was buy time and hope that Ayanna's brother had received their message and was riding to their aid. The standoff continued for almost an hour, with both sides watching each other across the empty ground between the buildings and Caldwell's line of riders. Occasionally, individual riders would approach closer to the ranch buildings, apparently trying to assess the defenders' positions and numbers, but They always withdrew when rifles were pointed in their direction. Finally, Caldwell himself rode forward under a white flag, stopping just close enough to make conversation possible without shouting. Jake walked out to meet him halfway, his rifle held casually, but ready for immediate use. "Change your mind yet, Morrison?" Caldwell asked without preamble. "You can see what you're up against. There's no shame in recognizing when you're outnumbered and outgunned." "The only thing I recognize is that you're trespassing on my property with an armed mob," Jake replied calmly. "That makes you outlaws, not righteous citizens defending anything." Caldwell's expression hardened. "We're defending the natural order that keeps white civilization strong and pure. What you've built here is an abomination that threatens everything decent people have worked to achieve in this territory. What I've built here is a successful ranch where people of different backgrounds work together peacefully," Jay countered. "If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why." "Because it gives ideas to people who shouldn't have ideas," Caldwell snapped. "Because it makes Indians think they're equal to white men, and it makes white men think it's acceptable to betray their own race. That kind of thinking is a poison that spreads if it's not cut out at the source." Jake realized that there would be no reasoning with Caldwell or his followers. They weren't interested in facts or evidence, only in maintaining a social order that put white men like themselves at the top of every hierarchy. The Circle M Ranch represented a challenge to that order that they simply could not tolerate. "Then, I guess we don't have anything more to talk about," Jake said, backing away toward his buildings. "I guess not," Caldwell agreed. "But, Morrison, when this is over, remember that you chose this. You chose to put your Indian-loving ideals ahead of the lives of your people. Their deaths are on your conscience, not mine." As Jake retreated to his defensive positions, he felt the familiar cold calm that had carried him through dangerous situations throughout his frontier life. Caldwell was wrong about one thing. Jake wasn't sacrificing his people for his ideals. He was fighting for his people, for their right to live and work together as equals, for their right to exist as a community that defied the racial hatred that had torn the territory apart for decades. The attack began just after noon with a volley of rifle fire that shattered windows and sent splinters flying from the wooden walls of the ranch buildings. Jake's defenders had expected this and were already in protected positions, but the sheer volume of incoming fire was intimidating even for experienced fighters. "Stay down and pick your targets," Jake shouted over the noise of bullets striking wood and adobe. "Don't waste ammunition on shots you can't make." The initial assault was designed to pin down the defenders, while Caldwell's men maneuvered into better positions. Jake could see riders moving to flank their positions from both sides, trying to surround the ranch buildings and eliminate any possibility of escape. It was a sound tactical plan that might have worked against a less prepared defending force. But Ayanna had anticipated this strategy during their planning sessions. Hidden rifle pits had been dug at key points around the ranch's perimeter, and as Caldwell's flanking parties moved into what they thought were undefended areas, they suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from concealed positions. The battle quickly settled into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with attackers trying to find weak spots in the defense, while the outnumbered defenders used their knowledge of the terrain and their prepared positions to maximum advantage. Jake was grimly satisfied to see that their planning had been effective. Despite being outnumbered 5-1, they were holding their own and inflicting casualties on the attackers. But ammunition was limited, and Jake knew that they couldn't maintain this level of resistance indefinitely. Sooner or later, Caldwell's superior numbers would begin to tell, especially if the attackers were willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve their objectives. It was during a brief lull in the fighting that Tommy's voice rang out from his lookout post. "Riders coming from the south. Looks like maybe 15 or 20 of them, coming fast." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. 20 riders could tip the balance of the battle decisively, but everything depended on whose side they were on. If Caldwell had managed to summon reinforcements, the situation would become hopeless. But if Ayanna's message had reached her brother, as the approaching riders drew closer, Jake could make out details that filled him with both hope and apprehension. The riders were clearly Apache, sitting their horses with the fluid grace that marked them as warriors born to the saddle. At their head rode a tall figure whose bearing and confidence could only belong to a war leader accustomed to command. Sai Shili had come. But The Apache War leader's arrival changed the nature of the conflict in ways that Jake hadn't fully anticipated. This was no longer a local dispute between neighboring ranchers that could be settled with a minimum of bloodshed and attention from outside authorities. The involvement of Apache warriors would be seen as an act of war by territorial and federal authorities, potentially triggering military intervention and a resumption of the Indian Wars that had supposedly ended with Geronimo's surrender. Jake pushed those concerns aside as the immediate tactical situation developed. Caldwell's force had been caught completely off guard by the arrival of the Apache warriors, who had approached from an unexpected direction and were now positioning themselves to attack the attackers from behind. The confusion in Caldwell's ranks was evident as riders milled about uncertainly, trying to understand what was happening and how to respond to this new threat. Some wanted to continue the attack on the ranch buildings, while others called for a retreat before they found themselves trapped between two enemy forces. Caldwell himself was shouting orders and trying to restore discipline to his ranks, but Jake could see that the ranchers' carefully planned assault was falling apart. The arrival of Apache warriors had introduced an element of chaos and fear that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Sayashili's war cry echoed across the desert as the Apache warriors launched their attack, striking Caldwell's force from behind with the swift, devastating efficiency that had made them feared throughout the Southwest. The sound sent chills down Jake's spine, even though he knew these particular warriors were fighting on his side. The battle became a confused melee as Caldwell's men found themselves caught between the defended ranch buildings and the Apache warriors attacking from their rear. Discipline broke down completely as individual riders fought for their lives without coordination or overall strategy. Jake's defenders joined the attack, pouring fire into Caldwell's disorganized ranks from their prepared positions. The rancher's superior numbers no longer mattered. His force was trapped, outnumbered, and fighting in conditions that favored their opponents. The fighting was fierce but brief. Within minutes, it became clear that Caldwell's assault had failed catastrophically. Dead and wounded men lay scattered across the ground between the ranch buildings and the desert beyond, while the survivors struggled to escape the trap they had walked into. Caldwell himself was among the casualties. Jake found the rancher's body near an overturned wagon where he had apparently tried to make a last stand. The man who had ridden onto Circle M property that morning with such arrogant confidence lay still and silent in the desert dust, his dream of racial purity dying with him. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Jake found himself face to face with Sayashili for the first time. The Apache war leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, with iron-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the harsh desert environment. His dark eyes held intelligence, strength, and a wariness that came from years of fighting for his people's survival. "You are the white man who saved my sister's life," Sayashili said in accented but clear English. "I have come to repay that debt. I appreciate your help." Jake replied carefully, very aware that he was speaking to one of the most feared Apache war leaders still at large. "But I'm not sure saving Ayana was something that created debt. It was just the right thing to do." Sayashili smiled slightly at that response. "Perhaps, but among my people, debts of honor must be repaid. Today, that debt is satisfied. But there may be other reasons for us to work together in the future." As they spoke, Ayana approached, moving with obvious emotion toward the brother she hadn't seen in over a year. The reunion between the siblings was subdued but deeply felt, conducted partly in Apache and partly in English for Jake's benefit. "The ranch still exists," Ayana told her brother in English. "The vision we discussed is still possible. For now," Sayashili replied grimly. "But this battle will not end the opposition to what you have built here. If anything, it will make your enemies more determined to destroy you." Jake knew the war leader was right. The involvement of Apache warriors in defending the Circle M ranch would be seen as proof of every accusation that had been made against them. Federal authorities would likely demand investigations, and military intervention was almost certain. The peaceful community they had tried to build was about to become the center of a much larger conflict. "What do you suggest?" Jake asked. Sayashili looked around at the scene of carnage, at the bodies of men who had died because they couldn't accept the possibility of cooperation between different peoples. "I suggest that you prepare for a much bigger war than this one, because whether you wanted it or not, You have become symbols of something that threatens the entire system the white government has built in this territory. They will not allow you to exist peacefully, no matter how reasonable or law-abiding you try to be. As evening fell over the Circle M ranch, Jake surveyed the aftermath of a battle he had never wanted but had been forced to fight. They had won, but victory felt hollow when measured against the cost in human lives and the certainty that more violence lay ahead. The quiet ranch where different peoples had learned to work together as equals was gone forever, replaced by an armed camp preparing for a war that would test everything they believed about justice, equality, and the possibility of change in a world built on hatred and division. The real test of their vision was just beginning. 15 years had passed since the battle at the Circle M ranch. 15 years since Jake Morrison had been forced to choose between abandoning his principles and fighting for the right of different peoples to live together in peace. The Arizona Territory had changed dramatically during those years, achieving statehood in 1912 and slowly modernizing as railroads, telegraph lines, and eventually even telephone connections linked the remote desert communities to the wider world. But some things remained constant. Racial tensions still simmered beneath the surface of Arizona society, and the memory of the Circle M Ranch incident continued to serve as a symbol, either of dangerous radicalism or of missed opportunities for genuine progress, depending on one's perspective. Jake himself had aged into a man of 47, his hair now streaked with gray, and his face marked by the lines that came from years of hard work under the desert sun. The ranch had prospered beyond his wildest dreams during the intervening years, expanding to encompass thousands of acres and hundreds of head of cattle and horses. But success had come at a price that sometimes kept him awake at night, wondering if the choices he had made had been worth the cost in human suffering. After the battle with Caldwell's mob in 1885, the federal government had indeed intervened, sending troops to investigate the involvement of Apache warriors in what they termed an insurrection against lawful authority. Jake had been arrested and charged with conspiracy to incite rebellion, harboring fugitive Indians, and various other crimes that carried the possibility of long prison sentences or even execution. The legal proceedings had dragged on for months, complicated by the political ramifications of the case and the difficulty of determining exactly what laws, if any, had actually been broken. Jake's supporters argued that he had simply been defending his property against an armed mob, while his detractors claimed that his alliance with Apache warriors proved his treasonous intentions. In the end, political considerations had trumped legal ones. The territorial government, eager to avoid any action that might encourage further Apache resistance, had quietly dropped the most serious charges against Jake in exchange for his agreement to certain conditions. He could continue operating his ranch, but he would be subject to regular government inspections, his Apache employees would have to be officially registered with territorial authorities, and any future involvement with hostile Indians would result in immediate forfeiture of his property. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that allowed life to continue. Jake had accepted the restrictions because the alternative was losing everything he had built, while his critics had accepted them because they believed constant government oversight would eventually lead to the failure of his dangerous experiment. They had been wrong on both counts. Under government supervision, the Circle M Ranch had actually become more successful than ever. Official inspections had consistently found efficient operations, excellent treatment of workers, and no evidence of any illegal activities. The ranch's reputation for producing high-quality livestock had spread throughout the Southwest, bringing buyers from as far away as California and Texas. More importantly, the ranch had become a model that other progressive landowners had begun to emulate. Slowly, cautiously, other ranches and businesses had begun hiring Apache workers and treating them as equals rather than as second-class employees. The changes were gradual and often met with resistance, but they were undeniable. Ayanna had been the key to much of the success. Over the years, she had evolved from Jake partner in ranch management to a respected leader in her own right, serving as an unofficial ambassador between the Apache communities and the white business establishment. Her intelligence, dignity, and quiet strength had won over many people who had initially been skeptical or hostile, proving that cooperation between different cultures was not only possible, but profitable. But the personal cost of their success had been enormous. The constant scrutiny, the ongoing threats from diehard opponents, and the pressure of serving as symbols of racial progress had taken a toll on both Jake and Ayana that was invisible to outside observers, but deeply felt by those who knew them best. Their relationship had deepened over the years into something that transcended the simple categories of friendship, partnership, or romance. They had become two parts of a single entity, each essential to the other's survival and success. But the social constraints of their time and place had made it impossible for them to openly acknowledge the true nature of their bond, forcing them to maintain a public facade that often felt like a betrayal of their private truth. It was on a warm afternoon in April 1900 that Jake received the news that would change everything once again. A rider arrived at the ranch carrying a telegraph message from the territorial capital, and the contents of that message sent shockwaves through the close-knit community Jake and Ayana had spent 15 years building. Sayashili is dead, Jake announced to the assembled workers and residents of the Circle M ranch. Killed in a skirmish with Mexican federals near the border 3 days ago. The silence that followed was profound. Ayana's brother had been more than just an Apache war leader to the people of the Circle M. He had been a symbol of resistance, a reminder that some Apache still lived free in the mountains, and a protective presence that had helped deter the most violent opponents of Jake's integrated community. Ayana received the news with the stoic dignity that had carried her through 15 years of struggle and triumph, but Jake could see the pain in her dark eyes. Sayashili had been her last direct connection to her Apache heritage, the final link to the world she had left behind when she chose to build a new life at the Circle M ranch. "How did it happen?" she asked quietly. The messenger, a young Apache man who had ridden hard for 3 days to bring them the news, spoke in halting English mixed with Apache phrases. He was leading a raid to free Apache children being held at a Mexican mission school. The Federals were waiting. It was a trap. He died fighting, but most of his warriors escaped with the children. Jake felt a chill of premonition as he realized what this news might mean for their small community. Sayashili's death would be seen by many whites as an opportunity to settle old scores without fear of Apache retaliation. The protective presence that had helped keep the most violent racists at bay was gone, and their enemies would not hesitate to take advantage of the changed situation. Over the following weeks, Jake's fears proved justified. Reports began filtering in of increased hostility toward Apache workers at other ranches, of mysterious fires at businesses that employed Indians, and of threats against white employers who continued to treat Apache workers as equals. The delicate balance that had allowed progressive experiments like the Circle M ranch to flourish was shifting, and not in their favor. The first direct threat came in the form of a letter delivered by a writer who disappeared before anyone could question him. The message was brief and to the point. "Your Apache protector is dead. Time to pay for your crimes against the white race. You have 1 week to close down your operation and leave the territory. After that, we make no promises about your safety." Jake showed the letter to Ayana and their core group of trusted employees, all of whom had remained with the ranch through 15 years of challenges and changes. The faces around the table reflected the same mixture of determination and weariness that Jake felt in his own heart. "What do you want to do?" Ayana asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I want to fight," Jake replied immediately. "This is our home, our life's work. I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of cowards with anonymous threats drive us away from everything we've built." But even as he spoke, Jake was aware that this situation was different from the confrontation with Caldwell 15 years earlier. They were all older now, their community more established, but also more vulnerable. They had more to lose and fewer allies to call upon. Sayashili's warriors were scattered or dead, and the territorial government was less sympathetic to their cause than it had been in the 1880s. "Fighting may not be enough this time," said Charlie Hawkins, now grizzled and gray, but still one of Jake's most trusted advisors. "These people have been waiting 15 years for a chance like this. They're not going to come at us with just 20 or 30 men like Caldwell did. They're going to bring everything they've got." As if to confirm Charlie's assessment, reports began arriving of a much larger and more organized opposition forming throughout the territory. Prominent businessmen, territorial officials, and even some federal authorities were openly calling for an end to what they termed dangerous experiments in racial mixing that threatened the stability of Arizona's push toward statehood. The opposition had learned from Caldwell's failure. Instead of relying on private militias and mob violence, they were using legal and political pressure to achieve their goals. New territorial regulations were being proposed that would make it virtually impossible for ranches to employ Apache workers. Federal authorities were being pressured to investigate the Circle M Ranch for tax violations, labor violations, and any other infractions that might justify government seizure of the property. Jake found himself facing an enemy that was both more powerful and more subtle than anything he had encountered before. These opponents didn't need to attack the ranch directly. They could simply strangle it with regulations and legal challenges until it became impossible to operate profitably. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. One morning in early May, a delegation of Apache leaders from the nearby reservation arrived at the ranch requesting a private meeting with Ayanna. They were men Jake had known for years, Apache who had chosen the path of accommodation with white authority rather than continued resistance. The meeting lasted for hours, conducted entirely in Apache, and when it was over, Ayanna emerged with tears streaming down her face for the first time since Jake had known her. "They want me to leave," she told him that evening as they sat on the porch where they had made so many important decisions over the years. "They say that my presence here is making things worse for all Apache people, that the white authorities are using the Circle M Ranch as an excuse to crack down on all Indian communities in the territory." Jake felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The idea that their success might actually be harming the people they had tried to help had never occurred to him, but he could see the logic in the tribal leader's argument. The Circle M Ranch had become such a symbol of racial integration that its very existence was being used to justify increased restrictions on Apache communities throughout the Southwest. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked, echoing the question Ayanna had asked him about the anonymous threats. "I want to stay and fight beside you," she replied immediately. "But I also know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go of what you want for the sake of something larger." They sat in silence for a long time, each lost in thoughts that were too painful to share. Finally, Jake spoke the words that he had never wanted to say, but that he knew represented the only honorable choice available to them. "Maybe it's time," he said quietly. "Maybe we've accomplished what we set out to do here, proved what we wanted to prove. Maybe now it's time to step aside and let others carry the work forward." Ayanna nodded, though Jake could see that the decision was breaking her heart as much as it was breaking his. Where would we go? What would we do? Jake had been thinking about that question for weeks, ever since the threats had begun escalating. "California," he said finally. "There are people there who share our ideas, communities where what we've learned here might be welcome. We could start over, build something new." "Together?" Ayanna asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Together," Jake confirmed. "If you want to. If you're willing to take that risk with a stubborn old cowboy who's too set in his ways to change." For the first time in days, Ayanna smiled, the same radiant expression that had first appeared on her face all those years ago when Jake had offered her a safe place to recover from her injuries. "I've been taking that risk for 15 years already. I think I can manage a little while longer." The decision to leave the Circle M Ranch was the most difficult either of them had ever made, but once it was made, they threw themselves into the task of ensuring that their departure would not destroy everything they had built. They spent weeks finding new positions for their employees, negotiating the sale of the ranch to buyers who promised to maintain fair employment practices, and transferring their accumulated knowledge to others who could continue their work. The night before their departure, the entire community gathered for a farewell celebration that was both joyous and heartbreaking. Workers who had become family, neighbors who had become allies, and friends who had become brothers and sisters in struggle came together to honor what they had accomplished and to promise that the vision of the Circle M Ranch would not die with their departure. As Jake and Ayanna prepared to leave the next morning, driving a wagon loaded with their possessions toward a new life in California, they were surprised by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A young Apache woman, perhaps 20 years old, approached their wagon with a kind of nervous determination that reminded Jake of Ayanna on the day she had first spoken to him about staying at the ranch. "My name is Desba," the young woman said in careful English. "I am the daughter of Itsachu, who worked here for many years. I have heard what you accomplished in this place, and I want to learn how to do the same thing in other places. Would you teach me?" Jake and Ayanna exchanged glances, and he saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Perhaps their work was not ending after all. Perhaps they were simply moving on to a new phase, one that involved teaching others to carry forward the vision they had pioneered. "Climb up," Ayana said, making room on the wagon seat. We have a long journey ahead, and there's much to discuss. As their wagon rolled away from the Circle M ranch toward whatever future awaited them in California, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken since that day 15 years earlier when he had found a dying Apache woman in the desert. He had saved her life, but in doing so, she had transformed his own life in ways he never could have imagined. Behind them, the ranch buildings grew smaller in the distance, but the legacy of what they had accomplished there would live on in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been part of their unlikely community. They had proven that people of different backgrounds could live and work together as equals, that cooperation was stronger than conflict, and that love could overcome hatred if people were willing to fight for it. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with new challenges and unknown dangers. But Jake Morrison and Ayana were traveling it together, accompanied by a young woman eager to learn from their experience and carry their vision forward to new communities and new generations. 15 years after a simple act of compassion had brought them together, they were embarking on the next chapter of their remarkable partnership, ready to face whatever trials and triumphs awaited them in a larger world beyond the Arizona desert. The story that had begun with a rescue in a remote canyon was far from over. It was simply moving on to new settings, new characters, and new possibilities for hope in a world that desperately needed examples of what human beings could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conflict. As the wagon disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert morning, the Circle M ranch stood silent, but not empty. The buildings would house new families, the land would support new dreams, and the legacy of what Jake Morrison and Ayana had built together would continue to inspire others to believe that change was possible, that justice was achievable, and that the simple act of treating all people with dignity and respect could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and perhaps even the world itself.